We now return to chain gangs on History's Mysteries.
January 31st, 1865. Congress ratifies the 13th Amendment to the Constitution, officially freeing all slaves.
The whites were confronted with the fact that 4 million people who yesterday had been their property were free people who would enter social life, the labor market, and perhaps even the political process.
Emancipation leaves the southern plantation farming system in chaos. Unable to entice or coerce former slaves to stay on, plantation owners turn to the government for help. It comes in the form of a new set of restrictive laws known as the Black Codes.
There's no way you can retract the freedom that's been given by the 13th, 14th, and the 15th Amendments, but what you can try to do is to limit it as much as possible, and that's what the Black Codes do.
White legislators create scores of new laws aimed solely at blacks that impose long prison sentences for petty larceny, mischief, insulting gestures, cruel treatment of animals, and even intent to steal. Suddenly, freed slaves find that they can be arrested at any time for virtually any reason. The population of southern prisons skyrockets, jumping 72% between 1860 and 1870. But war-torn states possess neither the facilities nor the finances to handle this sudden influx.
Many of the prisons that did exist in the South were too small because they had been constructed for that small group of whites prior to the Civil War, and they couldn't handle the new influx of African-American convicts.
December 28, 1866. Faced with dangerously overcrowded prisons, the Georgia legislature passes a law to farm out the penitentiary. Other southern states quickly follow suit, creating a network known as the Convict Lease system. They are now legally entitled to chain together their convict populations and lease them out to the highest bidders.
The convict lease system was a privatized system of prison labor. When prisoners were convicted in court, they were sent to the penitentiary, but it was a virtual penitentiary. They never entered into a prison. They immediately were slapped in chains and sent, for instance, to the coal mines in northwest Georgia, where they then were imprisoned in a stockade and spent their days working inside the coal mines for a private entrepreneur, not for the state.
Numerous former slaves are arrested and find themselves leased back to their previous plantation owners, often working under conditions worse than they had escaped.
In many ways, the convict leasing system was, in fact, worse than slavery. There is some sort of paternal bond that is built up under slavery between the slave owner and the slave. There is none under convict leasing. It is simply a way of working you as hard as you can, and when you die or when you're injured, they simply go back and get another one.
Critics question the legality of the brutal new system, but ironically, it is made perfectly valid by the very law that abolishes slavery. The 13th Amendment to the Constitution states that involuntary servitude is illegal in all cases except as a punishment for crime.
I think there's a general consensus between Northerners and Southerners that the abolition of slavery should not challenge the emerging penal system of that period, which was highly dependent on using convict labor in the North as well as the South. So there is a certain irony, but an irony that suggests a consensus in matters of punishment at a moment in which slavery was being abolished.
Just like slavery, the convict lease system is intended solely for African Americans. Southern white prisoners are spared the indignity of working in chains by a clever legislative loophole.
Mississippi passed a law saying that anyone who was sentenced to a term of 10 years or more could not go into the lease system, but was so dangerous that he must remain within the walls. Very, very few whites were sentenced to terms of less than 10 years. The reason being that whites only went to prison in the South at this time for the most serious of offenses.
Southern state officials love the convict lease system. It allows them to deal with an endless stream of convicts without building new prisons, and it makes them a handsome profit. By the early 1890s, Alabama generates 6 to 10% of its yearly state revenues from convict leasing. Prison officials exploit every opportunity in the name of profits. They even collect and sell convicts' urine to tanneries. When a convict dies, their body is marketed to medical schools.
The new regimes were fiscally conservative. They felt that the Reconstruction governments had been eager to spend too much money on things like black schools, black education. So fiscal retrenchment meant a desire not to spend much money on things like penitentiaries. Therefore, the privatization of the convict system was appealing because it proved to be a revenue generator for the state rather than a drain.
With so much money at stake, the new system becomes rife with abuses. Georgia State Senator Joseph E. Brown awards himself a 20-year lease for 300 convicts to work in his coal mines at the cost of 8 cents per inmate per day. Soon, unscrupulous entrepreneurs discover numerous ways to capitalize on the system.
You had a man like Jones S. Hamilton, who through bribery and other means won the right to lease all convicts in the state of Mississippi. What Hamilton did was to pay the state about $1 a month to rent every convict in the state. He then would sublease these convicts to plantation owners, railroad owners, factory owners for $9 a month. So if you're talking about thousands of convicts, Hamilton is making $8 a month on every convict he rents.
By 1877, the convict lease has become such a profitable enterprise that the Florida legislature abolishes its state penitentiary and leases out all the prisoners. There is little need for prison buildings in the post-war South. When we continue, inmates are driven to desperate means to escape the chains of the brutal convict lease system.
Self-mutilation was fairly common. You might cut part of your leg off, take off several toes.